Israeli elections are right around the corner and everything is on the line. The Prime Minister's office, the government, and the Knesset are all set to be decided. But with so much happening at once, we have to ask, how exactly does this all work? Now, maybe the most important point in this entire video is that the Israeli public does not elect the Prime Minister. The Israeli public is not voting for candidates for the Prime Minister. The Israeli public elects a Knesset. The Knesset is the Israeli parliament with 120 seats, and that is what is elected on election day. Later on, as we'll see later in this video, the Prime Minister will be selected and a government will be formed. Now, if Israel isn't voting for candidates for the Prime Minister, then what appears on the ballot? In Israel, voters vote for a list. So, leading up to the elections, the different political parties in Israel put out lists of their candidates for the Knesset. And instead of voting for one specific candidate for Knesset, each voter votes for one of those lists put forward by the parties. So, say on election day, the Green Party's list looks best to me, that's what I'll vote for. And if the Green Party ends up getting 12 seats in Knesset, the first 12 people on the Green Party's list will get into Knesset. But it's not that simple. There's a catch. In order to get into Knesset, it's not enough to get those votes on election day. In order to get in, a party has to pass the threshold. And the threshold is getting 3.25% of the vote. Any party that gets below that will not get in. So as we see in the example here, the Orange Party got 3.4% of the vote, so they're going to get in and get approximately 4 seats. The Red Party, on the other hand, got only 3.1% of the vote, so below the threshold. Now, that would be equivalent to 3 seats, but they're going to get 0. And this threshold exists to keep very small parties out of Knesset. Later on, when we discuss coalition building, we'll see why it's important to keep those small parties out. But suffice to say for now that anyone who doesn't pass this threshold is eliminated and all their votes are thrown in the trash because those were votes for parties that didn't get in. Now, there is a way around this. Say the Red Party and the Orange Party leading up to the election realize that they're sort of borderline cases and they're both afraid that they're not going to make it in. What they can do is combine and form a joint list. And instead of running as the Orange Party and the Red Party, both of which might be too small, they'll submit one list, the Orange and Red Party list. Now, together, in this case, they'll get maybe 7 or 8 seats, so they'll comfortably get in. And once they're in, they can go their separate ways and do whatever they want. So we'll sometimes see this leading up to an election in Israel. A number of small parties will form a joint list, run together and get in, and then split back up once they're already in Knesset. So we have this threshold that you have to pass, and there's a workaround that sometimes gets taken advantage of. In any case, once we've filtered out all the parties that were too small and thrown their votes away, we're left with the parties that made it. What we do now is count up all the valid votes, divide that number by 120, and now we know what a seat is worth. Now, it's important to point out that the seats are given out proportionally. So there's no concept of geographical dividing up. Israel isn't divided into different electoral sections. It's all one vote, and it's all one system. And the amount of seats that each party is going to get is in proportion to how many of the valid votes they got. So, for example, the Blue Party got 26.5% of the vote, so a little more than a quarter, and they're going to get 32 seats out of 120, a little more than a quarter of the seats. Now, the divide that we have up here in this example is very simplified. In reality, it doesn't divide up this elegantly. What do I mean? In reality, the Blue Party will say get 32.5 seats. and the Green Party will get 18 and a third, and the Orange Party will get 12 and a quarter. So what happens to all these bits and pieces? And the answer is one of two things. The first thing that can happen is two parties can sign a surplus vote agreement. We'll see this a lot leading up to the election. And what a surplus vote agreement means is that two parties agree that those little bits and pieces will combine to create another seat for one of them. So let's say blue and green signed one of these agreements. The blue party got 32 and a bit, and the green party got almost 18. That little extra bit that blue has will go to the green party, and they'll get that extra seat. So one way to deal with those bits and pieces is by signing surplus vote agreements. Now, what about all the pieces that either aren't covered by the agreements or that even with the agreement didn't really add up to a seat? What happens to all those extra votes is they're fed into some mathematical system, and eventually all 120 seats will be divided up proportionally to the parties that made it in. Now, at this point, the election process is essentially over because the Israeli public elected a Knesset, and after sifting through all the small parties and giving out the seats, the Knesset is now set and ready to go. So as far as elections and the role that the Israeli public has to play, we're finished. But there's still a lot of work to do. We still don't have a government, right? So we don't have a health minister, we don't have a defense minister, but we also don't have a prime minister. So although the elections are done and the public is finished, this new Knesset still has a lot of work to do. So what has to happen next? Now that the seats are divided up, as we saw, the heads of the different parties that come in, so the head of the blue party and the head of the yellow party, all the heads of the parties come to the president of Israel. Now, it's important to note the president of Israel is not like the president of the United States. The president of Israel does not really have much political power. He's more of a figurehead, so maybe similar to the King of England. But in any case, he doesn't make any big decisions here. He doesn't decide what the government will look like. He just plays a role in the procedure. So the heads of the parties that made it into the Knesset come to the president, and each head recommends who they think should form the government. The president listens to those recommendations, and according to those recommendations, he gives a presidential mandate to one of the members of Knesset. Now, usually the member of Knesset who gets that mandate is the head of the biggest party. But that doesn't have to be the case, as we'll see very soon, because the point here isn't who won on election day. The point here is who stands the best chance at forming a government. And based on the recommendations of the heads of the parties, that's what the president will do. Now, once that mandate is given, that member of Knesset has 28 days to put together a government. He can get a 2-week extension, but the details of the timeline don't really matter. What matters is the heads of the parties recommend someone. That someone gets the president's mandate, and the clock starts ticking. But what does forming a government actually mean? We've gotten the mandate, the clock has started ticking. What's supposed to happen? If we condense it into a sentence, forming a government means finding enough parties that are willing to govern together. So let's say this is our voting turnout. We have the blue, the purple, and the red parties who are in one political camp, and they have 56 seats between them. And then on the other side of the aisle, we have yellow, green, orange, and pink, who have 64 between them. Now, if we dial back a sec, when these parties come to the president, if pink, orange, and green recommend yellow, but red and purple recommend blue, yellow is going to get the president's mandate. Because even though blue is the bigger party, yellow is going to be able to form a government, whereas blue will not. So here we see a nice illustration of the fact that the president's mandate does not necessarily go to the party that got the most votes. Now, as we said, to form a government, we need to find enough parties that are willing to govern together. How much is enough? Enough is a majority. So the Knesset has 120 seats, so we need at least 61 to form a coalition. And so the parties start negotiating. Because here in this picture, it seems very simple. We have one team of parties that have a majority, we have another team that doesn't, and it's very easy to see. But usually there are a whole bunch of parties that are sort of on the fence, and negotiations get very tense and very messy, and sometimes they drag on. And in those negotiations, everything is on the table. So the different parties will discuss different policy commitments, they'll discuss different ministry positions, who's going to get to be minister of different things. They discuss different laws that they might want to pass. They discuss budgets. And most importantly, they discuss who's going to get to be prime minister. So all that is being discussed. The parties are negotiating. And here we can see a very interesting quirk or aspect of coalition politics. Let's look at the example on the screen. And let's say that the pink party, instead of just being on team yellow, that the pink party is undecided. And so we have these two clear camps. We have blue, purple, and red, who have 56. And we have yellow, green, and orange, who have 57. And then pink is undecided. Now, it's pretty easy to see at this point that pink holds all the cards. Whichever side pink decides to join is going to be able to form a government. And so pink can really punch above its weight and extort blue or yellow to get whatever it wants in order to form a government. So much so that pink can come to yellow, for instance, and say, you're either going to get nothing and blue is going to form a government, or I'll join you, you form a government, but me, the head of the pink party, I want to be prime minister. And yellow might say, fine, even though pink is a smaller party, this is our ticket to forming a coalition. And that would give us this crazy scenario where the prime minister of Israel is the head of a very small party just because of these negotiation games of who's going to get the majority. And this happens sometimes. And so the prime minister is not only not elected by the people, he's also not necessarily the head of the biggest party. All this gets fleshed out in the negotiations. And it's here that we see why the threshold we discussed is so important. Imagine if instead of having the pink party on the edge with its 7 seats, not sure where to go, imagine if instead of that we had 7 parties with 1 seat each. And the blue party and the yellow party each have to try to convince a few of these 1-seat parties to come to their camp. It'd be chaos. And these teeny tiny parties with very minimal support would suddenly have all the power in the world. So we want to avoid that. And we want the negotiations to really reflect how much of the Israeli public actually supports these different parties. We don't want a tiny little sliver of Israeli society who elected 1 little seat to control everything and potentially become prime minister. And so we set the bar. You need to pass the threshold to get in. And so even though a small party like the pink party here can pull all the strings and have a lot more power than it should, in reality, we sort of minimize that by having the threshold where it is. Okay, now, let's say we finally got through all the negotiations. The yellow party came to an agreement with green, orange, and pink. Everyone's on board. They have 64 seats between them. And they've agreed on how they're going to give out all the different things. Now we just have to solidify that officially. So the coalition came to some sort of agreement about different laws, budgets, who's going to get different roles, et cetera, et cetera. They present that to the Knesset, and the Knesset votes to affirm that government. Now, that vote is going to have a majority because, as we said, the coalition, has to have 61 or more, which basically guarantees that when the Knesset votes to affirm the coalition, basically, to affirm the government, it's going to have a majority vote. So it's almost a formality, but it's really what ends this whole process and sets the government going. So the parties agree between them on dividing up the different ministries and who's going to be prime minister. They come to the Knesset votes, the coalition votes in favor, and the government gets to work. The different ministers go to their jobs, and the prime minister gets started. But there's a catch, because all this is only true if everything goes to plan. But what happens if in those negotiations between the parties, nobody can put together a majority? Let's go back to our example. We have the blue camp, along with purple and red, who have 56. And let's say we have yellow, green, and orange in the other camp. Together they have 57. And we have pink, who we said is sort of undecided. But let's say pink isn't undecided. Let's say pink decided that they're not going to sit in the government no matter what. And so they're not willing to go with blue, and they're not willing to go with yellow. And so the heads of the parties came to the president. Let's say blue got the mandate. Blue tried to form a government, but he couldn't convince pink to come over. After blue failed and the time ran out, yellow then maybe got a shot, because if the first person who got the mandate fails to form a coalition in the allotted time, the president can give someone else a shot. So let's say blue failed, yellow gives it a shot, but yellow can't convince pink to come over either, and there's basically a stalemate. What happens when nobody can reach those 61 seats? And what happens then is that we go all the way back to square one, and the public votes again. They vote to form a new Knesset, and that new Knesset gives out the seats, and the heads of the parties that made it in come to the president, and one of them gets the mandate, and it all goes again. And basically, the different parties are hoping that in this round 2 of elections, they'll get a few more votes and maybe a couple more seats, and that will put them over the hump. And that's basically what we see here. Someone got the mandate, they couldn't put together a coalition, someone else got a shot, they also couldn't do it, and we go back to new elections. And this is one of the ways in which Israel can have elections more often than it should. Because on paper, Israel's supposed to have elections once every 4 years. In practice, we have elections far more often than that. There are a few reasons for this, which don't have to do with the electoral process, so we're not going to deal with them here. But one of the reasons for this can be a situation like the one we just described, where the elections go as planned, the Knesset forms totally fine, but nobody can put together that 61-seat majority. And the time runs out, and we have to start over and do a new vote. And that can even happen 2 or 3 or even 4 times in a row, where there's just a new election until a government forms. And so there we have it. We've run through the entire process, beginning with the vote that isn't a vote for prime minister, it isn't a vote for an individual, it's a vote for a party. The parties that then make it into Knesset distribute the 120 seats between them, depending on how many votes they got. And the heads of the parties then come to the president. The president gives one of them a mandate to go and form a government. In order to form a government, that member of Knesset has to negotiate together a coalition of at least 61, so a majority of the Knesset members. Once they come to an agreement, the government is officially announced and they get to work. If they can't come to an agreement and no coalition can be formed, we circle back to square one and vote for parties all over again. And so that's pretty much it. We've seen how the elections work, where the Israeli public elects a Knesset, but more importantly, we've seen how the Knesset then selects a government and, most importantly, a prime minister. And we've also seen how and why this can all take a while. And so if a month after the upcoming elections, someone asks you, wait, why isn't there a prime minister yet? You can send them this video and I'm sure they'd enjoy it. And if you enjoyed it, make sure to like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe so that you can stay tuned for whatever's next.